stand part of the question, and I call the member for New England.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, you don't have to, I suppose it requires some form of pseudo-profundity and doesn't require any Latinate mysticism to speak on a subject where we agree we need this levy, the Liberal Party agrees we need this levy, the Labor Party agrees we need this levy, and also so does the industry. Therefore, what is about to prevail is probably one of my most difficult 15 minutes to basically prattle on about something that everybody is in roaring agreement about. What I would say is that the SCAS system has provided a great capacity for the export market, and we can see in the export of cattle it's provided a great capacity for tapping of further markets. What I can say is back home on the dairy farm, the problems still abound with people getting ripped off by processors who are being pressured by major retailers. It doesn't seem to stand to the reality of what this House is supposed to do, that we still have farmers, especially in Queensland, who are just being held over a barrel. If we keep going down the path of squeezing these people, we won't have a fresh milk market, and it will start devolving from the top and make its way down. Once upon a time there were a heap of farmers on the Atherton Tableland. Now maybe there are a couple. Once upon a time we had dairy farmers in central Queensland. But the pressure just remains on them. You have a desire for fresh milk, well, you've got to support the dairy farmers who produce it. And what we have now is, we obviously in the southern part of our nation we have a different climatic circumstances, and we also have a different market. They're predominantly a solids market. That means they turn the milk into milk solids and export that. But the fresh milk market of the north, which is so vital for, I would say, one of Australia's accepted standards of living, that means you can go to the shop and get fresh milk, not reconstituted milk, not long life milk, but actually fresh milk. Well, that can only happen if you've got dairy farmers. And I always feel sorry for them because their numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller each year. And each year their numbers get smaller is a sign of policy failure from both sides of this chamber. And we always say that we're going to stand up to the major supermarkets, but we never do. We never do. We have, we have consumer laws, we have market laws, but we never really want to step on their toes. We never go that far. They're a bit too big and too powerful for us to take them on. And when you hear other issues where they go completely off the rails, we heard tonight about the Business Council of Australia supporting zero carbon emissions. Well, are they the ones who are going to reach into their pockets and help the people out when they lose their jobs? We successfully managed to send our whole manufacturing overseas. That was a clever trick. And now we sort of continue on in a precarious world where we've been tested by things such as COVID-19 as to what our resilience are if borders shut down. Yet we put forward a policy such as policy gets put forward such as zero or net zero carbon emissions, and we say we're going to reinstitute a manufacturing industry. I mean, it's like saying we're going to drive our car on square wheels. It's just not going to work. And if it is going to work, then where's it going to work? How are you going to do it? You're going to start subsidising manufacturing again. How on earth does that actually stack up? And I also heard about the NFF from the member from Hunter. We've got dairy farmers in his electorate, no doubt about that they believe in zero net carbon emissions. Well, I say to the NFF, be really careful what you wish for, because one of the super greenhouse gases is methane. And guess where methane's going to is preeminent in? It's in bovine ruminants. And what's one of the big areas where you get methane? It's in dairy farms. So how can you say that? How can you get yourself on the sticky paper on subjects such as this? So be careful. We know how this works. Everything that we do, I believe, is there is a challenge. There is a challenge between socialism and private enterprise. Socialism ultimately wants to have greater control over private assets such as land, basically tenure, title, and also income stream. And we've seen this, and I say this to the NFF, that as you've seen, tree clearing legislation came in, which basically divested the landholder of their title over something that they formerly owned, and vested into the state via state government, so they didn't have to pay compensation, without payment, vested into the state without payment. That means divested from a private individual, vested into the state, just like they did with hydrocarbonous materials that resided under the soil, which were initially part of the title as well, over a number of years. This is also part of this creeping socialism. And the next stage, of course, is to impose on the income stream. And what a better way to impose on the income stream than with a carbon tax? To think that everything you do, the more industrious you are, the more the government taxes you. Of course, it's where we're going to have a carbon trading scheme. And of course, if you're having a carbon trading scheme, you'll end up with a methane trading scheme. And what we'll have is farmers with a licence to basically to expel to the atmosphere a certain amount of methane, otherwise they have to buy permits from somebody else. And this, in an industry such as dairy, which is doing it so tough, that would be the final nail in the coffin, to try and put yet another cost on top of them. Now, of course, all the noble people would come out and explain to them the ways they could get around it or deal with it or manage a government tax. But another problem that we've got here is, I think, well, Nola Marino is a dairy farmer, but I don't think there are any others. Maybe I'm wrong. I can't think of any others in the whole building. In fact, to be quite frank, these days you can't find an awful lot of farmers in the building, or people who are actually on the land. So the problem we have with policy coming forward from here is it's driven preeminently by a construct of policy desires of an urban constituency, which ultimately are then foisted on a rural constituency. I mean, such things as zero carbon emissions, they don't really affect a white-collar workforce in the inner suburban areas. They don't really make an awful lot of difference in the short term. In the long term, as you get basically, you put more and more pressure on your real income earners, they do, because the actual money that's floating around the country starts to dry up. But in the short term, they don't affect an inner urban white-collar workforce. So then they can basically virtue signal and feel sort of morally responsible in going forward with a policy that sounds great but doesn't affect them. But in regional areas, it does affect us. It affects us massively. And in blue-collar working areas, it does affect them. It affects them massively. So that seems interesting, because when the member for Hunter talks about zero carbon emissions, he's got to remember that in his electorate, I'd say it's probably similar to the member for Patterson, certainly be similar to the aspirants of Labor Party members who want to be members for Central Queensland and North Queensland. In those seats, that is just a clarion call that you don't want them to have a job. And they're seeing it as such. And we're also seeing now that, in this sort of in this realm of this debate about so-called carbon policy, climate policy, call it what, we managed to cure climate change in New England. I know the Deputy Speaker was going through the other day, almost froze to death. So maybe we're doing a good job, because it's been snowing up there. So I don't know. Maybe, mind you, I'm waiting for someone to blame snow on climate change as well. It's just a matter of time. Well, what we have to do is to understand that if we go for these policies, you are going to be putting people out of work. And we should realise it. And such things as the recent election in places such as Eden Monaro, with Labor with a record low vote, and of course on our side, well, we didn't win the seat. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's going to be interesting. This thing should sail right through. Agreed by the Labor Party, agreed by the National Party, agreed by the Liberal Party, agreed by the industry. Basically, we're oxygen thieves at the moment talking about it, but it allows us to touch on some other issues which are just as important. I might go on closing and say that pertinent to the dairy industry is one vital factor, that is water policy. Water policy and access to water is crucial whether you're in the north of the nation or in the south of the nation. And one of the biggest issues that we've had, political issues we've had, as areas especially along within the Murray-Darling and the dairy farmers' capacity to get access to water. Because if they don't get access to water, you won't have a dairy industry, no matter whether you're exporting it or dealing in the fresh milk market. And that's something I think that has to be addressed in a real way that shows real respect for places such as Shepparton or Coburn or Mildura. We have to have a water policy that underpins our agricultural capacity to produce for a domestic market and also do our very best in an international market. So in closing, I'll say one thing. We've spent a lot of money, an awful lot of money, during this COVID crisis. We are seeing our debt, our gross debt, I think it's $744 billion today, last time I checked on AOFM. I remember I was the shadow minister getting booted from the job because I had the gall to say that it's going to break through $100 billion, and if we didn't change the trajectory, it'd go through $500 billion. We can leave that behind. It's $750 billion now. But we're going to have an economy that can actually pay this back. And I haven't heard a plan from anybody, on how we pay this money back. Not one. Not a one. I mean, going back, if you want to hear pseudo-profundity and Latinate mysticism, as I started with, then it's people telling you that they're going to pay back the debt by, what is the thing? I think it's 2061. I mean, my God, most of the people in this room would be dead, and between now and then there'll be further depressions, recessions, wars, pandemics. And so we've got ourselves into a position, whether we like it or not. As I said back in 2010, we wouldn't pay any of the debt back. We haven't. The trajectory would continue on. It did. And it's not going to change. But if you did want to pay it back, then water policy is not the cure, but is one of the componentary parts. We should have been spending the money on major infrastructure items such as the Bradfield scheme, which moves money not to Lake Eyre, but actually moves it into the Murray-Darling Basin to try and secure up that water supply. For the further development of Queensland, for the further development of the western areas of New South Wales, to actually secure money for the dairy, secure water and funds for the dairy industry. If we had done that, then we would have created our own Snowy Mountain scheme that was the economic stimulus that we saw after the Second World War. But we've actually, now it becomes more difficult because we are getting further and further into debt. And it won't matter whether, and I hope we are, I hope the coalition's maintained as the government, but if they're not, it's going to be the Labor Party's problem as well. How on earth they go to an election, make a promise without someone asking the obvious question, how are you going to pay for that? So we have to grow our economy, and that works side by side with the support of the dairy industry, and one of the biggest components of that will be water policy. And one of the vital components of water policy is water infrastructure, which is going to require people to put away their sneering and sniggering and understand that you'll have to get water from where it's in abundance and move it to where it's a paucity. We've got rain at the moment, but that will pass, another drought will come. And where it's in abundance in the north of our nation, where it's in a paucity in the south of our nation, that's just a historical fact of what Australia is. And we should, if we're going to create a stimulus package, then one of the stimulus packages that'll actually create a legacy and a benefit for Australia in the very, very, very long term, just like the Snowy Mountain scheme did, would be to get underway the Bradfield scheme.